What's up everybody, welcome back to another video about the Zoom PodTrak P4. In this video I'm going to do a bit of an unfair comparison, however there's good reason for it. In this one we are going to compare the Zoom F6, which is a field recorder that costs over $600 and compare it to the PodTrak P4 for podcast recording, and this PodTrak P4 costs about $200 as of recording this video. This feature set of these two recorders, the build quality as well as many other things, are very specific to their use cases, but for the most part you can also use many of these features for both environments, for podcast recording and for field recording. Now there is a 3x price difference, with the Zoom F6 being way more expensive than the PodTrak, but let's dive in and see what these two can do equal, as well as where one might have a foot over the other. For a quick disclaimer, the Zoom F6 is an audio recorder that I use here in my studio and I purchased with my own money. The PodTrak P4 was provided by Sound Services GmbH, a company here in Germany who was kind enough to loan this to me and for me to make these videos. This device will be sent back to them once I am done making these videos. With that said, there's one more thing, and that is that I have a full playlist of videos about the PodTrak P4, specifically comparing it to different audio recorders and also having a full review as well as some feature walkthroughs. So that's going to be linked in the description below. There's also going to be a specific playlist that is about the Zoom F6, which is specifically interesting if you also want to learn about 32-bit floating point audio recording, which we will talk about in a moment, but also many of the other aspects of this recorder. Now with all of that said, let's jump into the comparison between these two recorders. As I've already mentioned, they have a strong price difference, with the Zoom F6 being around $600 and the PodTrak P4 being around $200. And that's already apparent also in the build quality. The F6 has many metal parts, like for example the chassis up here, as well as all around. So if you turn this over on the bottom, you have a bit of plastic, but you always have this border, which is kind of metal build quality. So that's already something. The PodTrak, on the other hand, is a complete plastic build, except maybe this little door right there for the USB-C ports. Now, as a comparison in terms of sound quality, I have these two Shure Beta 57A microphones right in front of me, and one of them is recording the PodTrak or into the PodTrak, and the other one is recording into the Zoom F6. The PodTrak, of course, has its max recording at 44.1 kilohertz and 16-bit, and that's actually the point that goes completely to the Zoom F6, of course, with the 32-bit floating point audio, and more than 96,000 kilohertz if you want to use that. You can go up to 128 as far as I believe. However, I usually use it at 48 kilohertz because that's usually enough. The 32-bit floating point, however, is a complete game changer, and I have made a video specifically about that with this recorder, and also how that might actually be useful in certain circumstances and not so much in others. And that's actually something that I want to point out here straight away. Obviously, this recorder, the F6, features that 32-bit floating point audio, and the Zoom PodTrak does not. However, for the circumstances that you would use the PodTrak in, the 16-bit 44.1 kilohertz are usually completely enough, and that is with that scenario of mostly being for voice recording. And you're also possibly hearing that difference between the 32-bit float and the PodTrak in that ability of me doing more post-processing, for example, adding a little bit of loudness normalization to those tracks. Now, there are many things different about these two recorders. One is made for podcasters, the other is made for film sets and similar things as a field recorder. However, I also purchased the Zoom F6 with the thought about podcast recording and, of course, using it in this type of production for videos, interviews, and similar things. With the PodTrak P4, however, you get a lot of features that the Zoom F6 does not feature, which are super helpful for that podcast recording, and especially if you are trying to fully finish your podcast right then and there. One of those benefits, for example, is the sound pad, which is right there integrated into the PodTrak, and I also have a video specifically about this, describing the playback modes as well as how you can assign sounds to these buttons in a different video linked in the description below. Now, these buttons are really helpful if you want to do a fully finished podcast right then and there. With these buttons, you can, for example, have an intro, outro, as well as other sound effects on there programmed. And when you hit that button and you adjust the volume here for the sound pad channel, you will be able to just have these play within your podcast recording. I think this can be especially interesting if you, for example, also want to include listener questions in your podcast, and you can just program one onto the button B, for example, and then press that button. It plays back. As you start answering, you can pause that playback, and then you can start the playback of that question again to finish listening to that. And of course, you can always just talk over these effects or sounds or music that you are playing on those buttons. So that's definitely a feature that is not present in the Zoom F6, and you would have to find a very different solution for that kind of functionality that is available in the PodTrak Easy with these buttons. Another benefit that the Zoom PodTrak P4 has over the Zoom F6 or most of the handy as well as field recorders is that it has 4 headphone ports right at the bottom of the device. These are stereo mini jack connectors, and also each of these has its individual volume control. This is super handy so that everybody can hear everybody, including themselves, on specific headphones for each individual person. And this is specifically valuable because that way people notice when they're speaking directly into a microphone, or if they are speaking above it or sideways to it or similar things, so that they notice how different that actually sounds when they actually speak directly into it or at least very close to it. So that's a benefit right there. Another benefit is that you have the call and USB integration in a very specific way. This is something that's once more not present in the Zoom F6. However, in the F6, you have a different capability that may be able to replicate some of that functionality. Now, let's talk about the PodTrak first here. You have the ability to integrate calls with your phone and a TRRS cable or Bluetooth connection, which is an additional adapter that you have to purchase. And I have a video that's specifically about this kind of integration on the channel and also in that playlist linked below. You also have the ability to integrate audio from your computer right here in channel 4. And with that, for example, you can record a Skype call or some sound effects or music playing from your computer. Additionally, the stereo mixdown of the PodTrak will also be sent via USB-C to your computer so that you can actually use this as an input source. So as a microphone input, for example, in a program like Audition to have a recording running on the screen, and also send that signal, for example, to your Skype guest as their audio. With that, you also have a feature that's called Mix Minus built right into this device, and there you can activate this for the USB port, and for the phone port it is always active. This is specifically interesting because then the phone call or the Skype call will not hear themselves, but they can hear everybody else who is also in the room. Now, this is a feature set that is not really present in the Zoom F6. There are similar capabilities with routing and stuff like that. However, those are way more complicated to set up, but they can get this job done to a certain extent. So this is something where the PodTrak just makes things super easy to integrate with each other and work with, instead of the F6, which is way more elaborate and complicated. Now, a couple of things that both of these feature in different and varying degrees. They both have XLR inputs. The Zoom F6 has 6 of them. There are 3 on each of the sides, and I am right now recording the Octava up here into this recorder as well as this microphone right here. And of course, we also have all the dials and stuff like that here on the front. You have one volume dial for each of these, and of course you have a screen, which is in this case color, and also have your menu buttons as well as your record and play buttons. There's also timecode, which is not present on the PodTrak, and that's something that's really interesting for video making and video interview creation. And of course you have a headphone jack, but just one, and you also have a line out right here. Now, on the other hand, you have 4 XLR ports on the PodTrak, which are located at the top of the device. You have their gain controls right here, and that is that. In terms of phantom power as well as similar things, the Zoom F6 gives you way more customizations. You can change between line input and mic input for every single XLR input, and you can also choose to link a USB output to the XLR port so that you can output audio out of those. And you can of course also activate phantom power for each and every single one of them. On the PodTrak, you also have phantom power. So if you have something like the PodMic or the Shure SM7B, those microphones need phantom power, and that's something that you can provide with these switches. Also, these have different powering solutions. They both have the ability to power with internal batteries, where the Zoom F6 has this battery compartment, and there you have space for 4 AA batteries, and the PodTrak has one battery compartment at the back here, which takes 2 AA batteries. You can also use USB-C power on both of these devices. In this case, I have them both hooked up via USB-C, and that basically functions as an override to any other power solution so that you have this internal battery as a backup. And both of them feature the ability to actually hot swap between battery sources. So if you have the internal AA batteries inside of the PodTrak or the Zoom F6, you can just unplug the USB-C power, you continue recording, and then you can plug in a new USB-C power source, which is again charged, or maybe a wall outlet or something similar. The F6 also features a connection for a NPF style battery, I think is what it's called. This is the connector right here at the back, and this is the battery connector for this type of battery. So this way you basically have 3 ways of powering the Zoom F6 with the AA batteries, 4 of them. You have the NPF style battery in the back, and you have USB-C power delivery. Both of these devices are capable of delivering a mixdown, so that's also something that's really powerful for both of them, so that you can basically finish your recording or your production right there on the device. Of course, with the PodTrak, you also have the sound pads, which is something that you don't get on the Zoom F6. But in general, you can theoretically finish your recording on the Zoom F6 with at least the guest part completely finished and mixed. You also have sound effects or sound processing capabilities on the Zoom F6. If you go into 24-bit mode, there are a couple more than in 32-bit mode. In 32-bit mode, for example, there's no limiter that is available to you because it makes no sense, because it is going to record the 32-bit floating point anyways, which you then can process later on in your post-processing workflow. However, if you switch into 24-bit mode, you can have an advanced limiter or a simple limiter. The advanced limiter is incredible. It basically takes care of anything that is too loud, and that is really, really cool. Of course, this is done because it also has the AAD converters, which give you a very clean signal, and the limiter has a 1 or 2 millisecond work window, which can just prevent clipping in the first place. Now, this also has a low-cut filter, which is, of course, also very usable. Now, on the other hand, we have the PodTrak P4, and there we just have a limiter and a low-cut filter. You have no customizations whatsoever. However, you can switch those on and off individually for each and every single of those XLR inputs. So that's really cool. What's also cool is that it is surprising how good the limiters are on this device. Specifically comparing it, for example, to the Zoom H5, and I have a video specifically about that in the description below, where the limiters are completely useless despite the Zoom H5 being a relatively comparable device in terms of its price range. However, the Zoom H5 is also way older than the PodTrak, so that might be one of the main reasons what is going on there and why this here is such an improvement over the Zoom H5. Both of these recorders can be used as audio interfaces. However, the Zoom F6 can be used as a multi-track audio interface, where the PodTrak can only be used as a stereo audio interface. So you can only send a stereo signal into it, and you also will only be able to receive a stereo signal, which is basically a mixdown of everything that's coming into the PodTrak, and that is going to be sent back to the computer. On the other hand, with the F6, you can record each individual track on the F6 also inside of, for example, Audition or any other NLE or audio editing program, so that you have those separated. That's really cool. Also, you have way more routing abilities with this here, where you can send things back to the computer and not, and those kind of things. With the PodTrak, it is way simpler in terms of its setup. However, there's just a USB mix minus feature, so that you can, for example, decide that the computer will not receive anything that it also sent. Now, with all of that said, I'm probably missing some of the aspects that I thought about previously, but generally speaking, who are these devices for and who should get which one? Now, first up, the PodTrak. Of course, this is an audio recorder made for podcasters. This is specifically interesting if you want to integrate calls and the likes. This is the recorder for you in that regard. It also has these sound pads, which are super useful, for example, for those integrations of intro, outro, sound effects, or similar things, which you just don't get on the Zoom F6. In addition, you basically get a finished file on this recorder with the extra features that you can also later on go into the multi-track file and then edit your podcast to your liking, or do some sound adjustments, like, for example, pull up the volume or reduce the volume of one of your speakers in that way. Now, with that said, the F6 gives you way more flexibility in the post-processing, specifically if you are going to choose the 32-bit floating point audio recording. And of course, if you do that, then you have way more ability in post-processing with effects, with EQing, with loudness normalization, and those things. The AA converters on this are the best that I have heard in terms of an audio interface or audio recorder, but I also have not tried anything that's above this range in terms of its pricing. So the better audio quality is probably going to come, or definitely going to come, out of the Zoom F6. But I think for someone who is just going to do podcast recording with voices and interviews, the PodTrak is the smaller, lighter, and in total much easier to use device than comparing it to something like the F6. If you, however, do want the utmost quality, the best file that you can work with in the post-processing, and you do want to work with that post-processing process, then I would say the F6 is a very interesting choice, and I am glad that I have invested into this device. It's a super, super cool audio recorder with those 32-bit floating point audio things, and of course with the ability to also go into those other modes. Having a, for example, 24-bit finished file with these high quality limiters, with these advanced limiters, that is really, really, really cool. But on the other hand, I have to say, if I were to just start out with podcasting and I want to have something that's easy to set up, I don't want to work with all the details and nitty-gritty things that I have to get to know if I want to process these files from the F6, as well as all the other setup things, then this is a really cool device that is able to deliver an incredible product. Now, I think that's a wrap for this video, and I hope it was interesting for you to hear the comparison here, as well as me talking about these different aspects of these two recorders and who might be more interested in which one. If you have any questions about these, please leave those in the comment section down below, and I will try to answer you there or make a video specifically about your question. That, of course, is not necessarily possible with the PodTrak, since that's going to be sent back to Sound Services GmbH soon as I am done with these videos, because they were kind enough to provide me with this as a rental device. Now, with all of that said, I hope you were able to hear some of the differences between these two recorders in these sound samples or with this microphone setup, and of course that it was helpful. If it was, please give this video a thumbs up. That helps out a lot with the YouTube algorithm. And of course, subscribe to the channel for more videos like this and on other topics so that you stay up to date. Now, all I have to say is there are links in the description for more videos, and I will have some of them here on the screen, which are all about the Zoom PodTrak P4, and there is a full playlist of it. Now, with all that said, I hope you have an amazing day, make it your life, create your podcast, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao, ciao!